Ballistic movements are movements which reach a maximum velocity and acceleration in a short period of time, things like throwing or striking. How do movement patterns from other sports compare with those in internal martial arts? For this analysis, I've chosen sports that involve throwing and striking. For the throwing, I've selected javelin and the slide and glide technique of shot put throwing. And then for the hitting, we have baseball batting and tennis. And then onward to boxing. And then comparing movements from Tai Chi and Xing Yi. The javelin throw consists of a couple phases. First, there's running start, then going to a cross step while stretching back, and then planting and executing the throw. So these analyses will consist of two parts. First will be the position of the shoulders with respect to the pelvis, and then the second part will be analyzing the various muscles involved, mostly concentrated in the trunk and the directions of the pull. Okay, here's our running start. See the arm comes back, stretching. And here we go. There's a part right before the throw. See the shoulders are rotated, basically facing us. And then the hips are also rotated, but not quite as much. Still a bit forward. And then we have this slight torso lean backwards. Although the center, I draw a line through the center of the body. Not all the way back, but still slightly back in between the two legs. And we continue. Position stays roughly the same upon landing. And then we transition, big step out. And we see here, arm is externally rotated. And then we have this big stretch from top to bottom through the front of the thigh and the torso. Shoulders and pelvis are tilted, and our center of gravity, or the center of the body, shifts closer to in between the two legs. And then we have our transfer. We see this big twist happen, arm really externally rotated. And then we also get this twist down to the thigh, hips turn in, front forward plants. And then body rotates forward. There's our shoulders. The pelvis is basically facing straight ahead. Torso starts facing that way. And then we have our center roughly right in between the two legs here. And there's the end position with the follow through. Arm has ended up all the way forward. Javelin's been released. Weight has shifted closer to the front leg, and the shoulders have rotated all the way. Hips are now facing forward, and the movement is complete. Now we can go through and look at the muscle tension. So we have this running start again. Pulling back. And here we go. Now what we see here is in the left side of the body, the is twisted. So we have the external obliques pulling the rib cage towards the middle of the pelvis. And then on the opposite side, we have the internal obliques pulling the sternum towards the pelvis, and then vice versa. On this side, the external obliques will be stretched, and the internal obliques on the other side will be stretched. And then we have a stretch opening of the chest on the right side of the body, and then we have This arm is not quite as involved. It comes to the front a little bit, which is with this arrow. It's being adducted, being pulled towards the center of the body. And with the cross step, we see the hip inflection, the lower leg inflections, a little bit of activation of the hamstring. So we get this stretch here in the front of the thigh, the rectus femoris, and probably other muscles. And then the opposite here, since this hip is in flexion, we get a contraction of those muscles. Okay, so body comes down, roughly the same situation. Okay, and we get this nice big stretch here. See, now at this point, the other arm has started to swing out. So now you have a complete stretch across the chest. This arm is externally rotated, so you probably get a stretch across this deltoid here. The torso remains roughly the same position. And now we have activation of the hamstrings and the glutes as we go into extension. And now that this foot is planted, it is receiving force to keep the front leg straight. We got activation or contraction in the rectus femoris to keep the knee locked out. Step down. See that contraction here. Posterior chain activating, pushing forward. We see this big stretch, very obvious in this position here. Still have this turned out, so nice big stretch through here. And we're starting to enter the active phase here. So now we're turning in the opposite direction. So now the opposite external obliques are contracting, which were stretched before, and the opposite internal obliques are contracting, which were stretched before, and vice versa. We go through into the throw, finishing the throw. Stretch here through the lats as the shoulder comes forward, protracted, contraction in the chest muscles, the pectorals. Hip is still in extension, so activation of the glutes, and everything else remains the same. The throwing technique I'm going to show now is known as the slide and glide technique. It consists of a stretch followed by a tuck, big step out, and then throw. Here's one more time. Okay, now let's go and break down the movement. So big stretch through the opposite side, hinging at the hips. Non-throwing arm is very relaxed, just kind of dangling out. Knee comes in, tucks, and we see the hips and shoulders are aligned. Body's in a slight flexion. Knee is flexed on both sides. There's a little bounce, extension, then relaxing back into this crouch position. Hips and shoulders still even. And then we see this big step out. A little bit of rotation. Torso starts to rise. Foot lands. Other trailing foot hops in. And a big twist going into extension and follow through with the throw. So we go back. So hips and shoulders in line. Still. Hips and shoulders are tilted. Weight is distributed over the back foot. Now we see in the rotation, basically at the release, hips and shoulders in line, big rotation, body in pretty good state of extension. Weight is now centered in between the two legs. and then completing the twist. Shoulders are now rotated with respect to the hips, and weight is centered. Okay, now we'll look at the muscle tension going through here. Body inflections will have some activation in the abdominal region here. Perform that tuck and stretch through the back. Hip is in flexion, so stretch through the glute. All right, and then as the throw starts to execute, we get extension here in the rear leg, so that's a contraction in the front thigh muscles, stretch through the thigh muscles of the extending leg as it stretches out, activation in the glutes as the leg goes into extension. So the front foot lands, the hips we see here are open, so we got to stretch here through the adductor muscles. We're rotated, so on the non-rotated side, we have activation of the external obliques. On the side we're rotating to, activation of the internal obliques, and then stretch or relaxation of the antagonist muscles on each side. And then here, as we turn and rotate, the muscles that were stretched in the torso and relaxed are now strongly contracting, and the ones that were contracting are now relaxed. We get contraction through the glute and the hamstrings, pushing off, putting the body into extension, and we get that big stretch going through probably the rectus abdominis and the rectus femoris in the front thigh. There we get more of a side view as the body continues to follow through and rotate, pulling activation on the back muscles, trapezius, lats, and then stretching and relaxing of the trapezius on the throwing side. As it stretches out, the arm goes to a full extension. So we have the lats and trapezius stretched here, and we have the internal oblique stretch and external obliques contracting. Still, hip is still in extension, glutes, hamstrings, still have that big stretch across the front of the body. Now we'll go to a movement that should be familiar with most people, batting. So we see a wind up, then swing through. Okay, now we'll go through the position of the shoulder and hips as we go through the movement. See here, weight shifts over to the rear leg, front leg comes up and internally rotates. We have a tilt in the shoulders downward and a tilt in the hips upward, slight twist with respect to the hips and shoulders. We have our big step out. Shoulders and hips are rotated in opposite directions. We see the foot turns out, rear leg starts to turn inward, internally rotated, and our weight is still kind of shifted back over that rear leg. Come through with the follow through. Hips and shoulders are pretty much aligned at this point, though both are tilted at an angle. The torso is kind of at an angle. Weight is moving off the back leg, kind of roughly almost in the center, but still a little bit back weighted. And then we have our follow through. Now the shoulders are rotated pretty much as far as it can go with respect to the hips. Rear leg is rotated facing forward now. And the weight is mostly centered in between the two legs. Okay, we're going to go through the muscles now. Ready? Wind up. All right. Slight twist to the counter rotation side. Activation of the external obliques. Internal obliques on the ipsilateral side. And then stretch in the external obliques and stretch in the internal obliques. The front leg rises up. So we have some hip flexion, activation of the hip flexors here, and some internal rotation, and the legs kind of come together. So activation of the adductors. And we see that the pelvis is tilted. So a little bit stretch here in the opposite adductor and activation in the abductor muscle. So probably like the glute medius. The arms coming across the chest. So activation in the pectoral muscles. And this one's opening. So stretch here and then counter action in the back. Contraction of the trapezius, maybe some of the lats, and then stretch in the trapezius and probably lat as well. So we get the big step out. Now we've opened the legs or stretch here in the adductor muscles. The leg is extended, so rectus femoris now it's contracted. The legs started to turn out a little bit, so your external rotators activation. Hip is still tilted, so we have the abductors here, and then we're maintaining this activity in the torso and in the chest. And as we go into our swing, okay, we're at mid swing, basically ball contact. This leg is turned forward, so the internal rotators, your hamstrings, glutes, putting the hip into extension. This leg is still straight, but I'm going to argue that the main action is in the hamstrings, pulling the hip into extension. Arms is still across the body, so the pec is still engaged on the leading arm, and now also will start to become engaged on the trailing arm. And then we have that counter activity going on through the back as we rotate in the opposite direction with the front arm, rear trapezius muscle probably contracting as the arm kind of gets pulled back in the lats. And then we get the stretch on the other side. And then through the torso, the abdominal muscles switch direction as well. So now the external obliques on the other side of the body contract, and the internal obliques will now stretch. This continues throughout the swing, ending in the final position. So we see here external obliques contracted, internal obliques stretched. We see this nice big stretch through the torso. Lat is stretched. Lat is contracted here. Trapezius contracted. Stretch through the pec here, and now contraction in the pec. That was the rear arm and previously stretched. Now we're going to move on to a forehand in tennis. Okay, now we're going to look at the hips with respect to the shoulders and the center of gravity. Here's the wind up. Okay, shoulders rotated with respect to the hips. Rear leg has stepped out and rotated outward. Front leg has rotated outward a little bit. There's the start of the swing. Hips shift forward and tilt. Weight roughly centered in between the two legs. Shoulders still a little rotated past the hips. we're about to make contact with the ball. Hips and shoulders are starting to come in line. Rear leg turns in, front leg starts to turn out. Now we made contact with the ball. Hips and shoulders are in line. Rear leg continues to drive inward while the front leg turns outward. Now we have a full rotation of both legs. Now they're facing forward. Follow through. Shoulders are now rotated with respect to the hips. And end of the follow through. Shoulders and hips start to come back in line with each other, but still the shoulders are rotated with respect to the hips. Weight is now over the front foot. Now we'll go through and examine the muscle tension. Wind up. All right, wind up. The contralateral external obliques are activated. Internal obliques are relaxed. And then we go to the ipsilateral side. External obliques are relaxed and the internal obliques are activated. Legs are separated, stepping apart. So we have relaxation in the adductors, a little bit of a stretch there. Activation in the abductor muscles. If we look at the upper body, this front hand is pulled across, so activation in the pec muscle on that side and relax on the other as the hand is pulled back. So then we have activation on the trapezius on the rear, maybe a little bit of the lats, and then relaxation of the trapezius on the other side, and relaxation on the lats, and then activation in the serratus anterior. As we go through the swing, everything basically reverses. So now the external obliques here activate, and the internal obliques on the other side activate, and then the internal obliques on this side relax, and the external obliques on this side relax. Hips shifting forward, pulling the pubic bone towards the femur. So activation here in the adductor muscles, heightening the stretch here in the other adductor. And then now this pec starts to relax as the arm swings out. Trapezius muscles, serratus posterior start to pull on the back, and this one relaxes and this pec activates. We go through all of those same muscles in the torso and upper body are basically in the same state. Continue to contract and relax as previously stated. Now the legs, the hamstrings and glutes will activate on this rear leg as our body turns forward and the hip starts to go into extension. And then same on this front leg, even though it's somewhat straight, hamstring is pulling the hip forward, and this rotation inward is due to activation in the adductor muscles. That continues. We make contact. We see it's still this internal rotation in this front hip as the front foot is still facing towards us. Hasn't rotated, so we have a bunch of tension here, which then gets released as the foot is allowed to rotate around. Pulling action continues as his leg comes back. Pushing action continues in the other leg. Everything else the same. We can get a better look at the back. See the lats would be stretched here as the arm is up and away. Trapezius, different angles on that side, and as the other arm starts to pull back, we have the lats pulling, trapezius muscles pulling, probably the serratus muscles pulling, rhomboids. And then we finished in this rotated position. Hips in extension, shoulders are rotated, and we see the back, everything pulling inward and everything stretched on the other side. Now we're going to move on to examples from boxing. You'll see here a wind up, slip. Hips are rotated with respect to the shoulders. See this pretty big twist here in the body. Weight is still centered. Come through to the point of contact. Hips and shoulders are now in line. Body counter rotates. Legs and knees are now rotated as well. And then we have the follow through. Onto the muscular tension. We have the wind up. Activation in the external obliques, causing the body to turn. Relaxation in the internal obliques. We have the pull on the back side of the lats, pulling the arm back. Activation in the adductors, the twist in the hips, and activation in the glutes and hamstring, pushing the leg forward. We go on. Contact point, counter rotation, external obliques activate, internal obliques relax, and then vice versa on the other side of the body. Internal obliques activated, external obliques relaxed. Adductor in the rear leg is now activated, pulling the hips around, and the glutes on the other side are now activated, driving off the front leg. Now we're going to look at a boxing right hand. Begin with the starting position. See the hip is in flexion, shoulders tilted down a little bit, knees both facing forward. This one's rotated inward, this one rotated outward. Here's the wind up. Shoulders maintain this tilt. See the legs separate, balance is in the middle, stretch across the chest. Here as the punch starts to execute, hips are turning. Hips are leading the shoulders, and the weight is still in the middle. Back leg rotates inward. You see here now the hips and shoulders are in line. Rear leg is completely facing forward now, driving off the back leg. We see the heel lifted, pressing into the ball of the foot. And now the shoulders are rotated beyond that of the hips. Weight still in the middle. Ball of the foot pressed against the ground. Made contact with the opponent. And there you have it. Now we'll take a look at the tension. Here we go, we're in the wind up. We're going to reference everything off the punching hand. So the contralateral external obliques are activated, and the contralateral internal obliques are relaxed, and vice versa. The ipsilateral internal obliques are activated, and the ipsilateral external obliques are relaxed and stretched. The front foot is stepped out a little bit, so the adductors are stretched. This leg is turning in, so we have activation in the adductors, maybe the inner part of the hamstrings, and then the glute medius is relaxed. We've got the stretch across the back here in the front lat and trapezius, and then contraction as this arm pulls back in the trapezius on this side of the body. Go through as the punch is being executed. Contraction in the glutes, probably the hamstrings as well, as we push off this back leg. Stretch here in the rectus femoris as the hips start to go into extension. Pulling with the front foot, so hamstring, maybe some adductor action. On the ipsilateral side, we have contraction of the external obliques, relaxation of the internal obliques, and then the opposite on the other side, contraction of the internal obliques and relaxation of the external obliques. The arm starts to come forward. We'll have some activation in the pecs, and the opposite arm, it'll relax as it stretches on the other side and pulls back through the trapezius and or lats. We get more of the same as the punch continues. And we'll see this, point out this stretch here from the knee all the way up. You see this nice straight line. And then we see from the back leg continues to drive, front leg continues to pull. The lats here on the back are stretched, trapezius stretched, internal oblique stretched, as the shoulders continue to rotate past the hips. We have the pulling action on the other side of the body through the lats, the abdominals, and probably the trapezius. Here's an example of some combination punching. There's going to be a series of 3 punches. Starting off with the first. Look at the position here. Okay, we see the shoulders are rotated with respect to the pelvis, a little bit of a slight lean. Weight is closer to the front foot. So the body rotates, hips and shoulders rotate together, and both legs rotate along with the torso. There's the first little shovel hook. And we're getting ready to load up for an uppercut. Some hip flexion. Shoulders and hips are roughly in line, and weight is centered in between the 2 legs. Now we have the shoulders rotated with respect to the hips. Legs rotate along with the hips. So now the knees are facing forward, and here we have the uppercut. Now we're moving on into the left hook. So from the position, last position with the uppercut, knees facing forward, shoulders and hips facing forward. Now everything rotates, shoulders and hips together, along with the legs. So these are now facing out towards us. Okay, now we're going to get the muscular tension. All right, loading up for the shovel hook. So now the contralateral external obliques are activated, internal obliques relaxed, and then vice versa on the ipsilateral side, the side throwing the shovel hook. Internal obliques are activated and external obliques are relaxed. The pec on the ipsilateral side is stretching, relaxes, the arm pulls back. And we have rotation here in the pelvis, so probably some adductor action in the leading leg. So as you rotate, the rear leg has action in the adductors, pulling the pelvis in towards it, front leg adductor stretching, pushing off the front leg, and externally rotating in the rear leg. Action in the torso reverses, so now the external obliques on the ipsilateral side are activated and internal obliques are relaxed, and on the contralateral side the internal obliques are activated and external obliques relaxed. Pectoral muscle now activates. So we wind up for the uppercut. Here we have activation in the ipsilateral side of the external obliques, relaxation in the internal obliques, contralateral side, internal obliques activate, external obliques relax. We get rotating into the front leg, so activation in the adductor muscles, and then extension here in the rear leg, so maybe some activation in the glutes. So pushing off. So yeah, we have here, hip goes into extension, glutes, probably some hamstring, rotating into that front leg, probably some adductor participation, lats and trapezius on the back side relax as the arm drives up forward, external obliques on the ipsilateral side activating, internal obliques relaxed, and on the opposite side, the contralateral side, the trapezius, probably some of the lats activating, pulling the other side back. Now we go the other direction, finishing with the hook. So the pec on the ipsilateral side throwing the hook, activation, other side's pulling back, relax on that pec, lats on the ipsilateral side relaxed, contralateral side activated, and we see that all the way down. External obliques activated, internal obliques relaxed, external obliques relaxed, internal obliques activated. And then we're turning into the rear foot now, twisting in the pelvis, so activation in the adductors. And our last movement is from Tai Chi. Okay, we'll start this starting position. One leg is lifted, knee bent. Hips and shoulders are roughly in line with each other. Weight is distributed across the supporting leg. Front leg starts to step out. Hips and shoulders are still in line. Now weight is shifting forward, moving towards the center between both legs. Foot steps down. And then we explode out. Torso rotates the opposite direction. Hips and shoulders are rotated from each other. Both legs turn. One leg turns out, the other one turns in. Now let's look at the muscular tension. Both arms are pulled in, so adducted. So we have both pecs contracted. The back is stretched. Trapezius stretch on both ends. Possibly the lats as well, as the arms are both forward in front of the body. They're slightly turned to one side, so possibly some activation in the external obliques and internal obliques on the opposite side, and then relaxation in the internal obliques and external obliques. The leg that's lifted, activation in the hip flexors and in the adductors in the standing leg. So the legs are pulled together. So front leg fully extends, so activation in the rectus femoris to straighten the knee. This leg is going out, so maybe some stretch in the adductors, maybe the hamstrings, since the leg is fully extended and the hip is flexed. And then we continue with that same activation in the torso. External oblique here, activated. Internal oblique here, activated. And then internal oblique relaxed here and external oblique relaxed here. Back is still rounded. Relaxation in the trapezius, maybe some activation in the serratus anterior and the pecs. As we execute the movement, chest opens up, so both of the pecs now go to a relaxed and stretched position. Back contracts, so the trapezius contracting here, pulling the arms back. Possibly some contraction in the lats as well. The state of the external and internal obliques switch to the opposite. Now we have the external oblique here, activated, and internal oblique here, activated, and the internal oblique on the opposite side relaxed and external oblique relaxed. The front leg starts to turn in, so activation of the adductors, maybe the vastus medialis. Opposite leg turns out, so stretch in the adductors, relaxation in the adductors, and activation in the external rotators of the hip. Okay, now we finally made it through all of these sports, and we're going to move on to movements from internal martial arts, starting out with Xing Yi. Here's an example of Bung Chuan. Move on to breaking down the position. So it's pretty upright. Hips forward, shoulders rotated with respect to the hips. Weight centered. So your hips and shoulders are in line. Weight centered over the feet. Foot steps out, hips and shoulders turn. Weight is distributed, centered in between the feet. Then move on to the next part of the movement. Small step out, hips and shoulders. Hips are starting to turn here with respect to the shoulders. Hips and shoulders are roughly in line. Weight is distributed in between the feet. And finishing position, shoulders rotated with respect to the hips. Weight down through the center. Onto the muscular tension. Starting position, we see the external obliques active, internal obliques relaxed, lats stretched, trapezius stretched, the whole back here stretched. And then we have activation on the other side of the internal obliques, relaxation of the external obliques. Okay, we enter the first punch part of Bung. We have the external obliques on the ipsilateral side of the punch, active, internal obliques relaxed. The pec on this side activates a little bit. It's probably the pec minor, as the back is still rounded. The chest isn't really contracted hard. Internal obliques on the contralateral side, active. External obliques relaxed. Feet separated a little bit, so adductors are stretched, and this foot steps out, so contraction in the rectus abdominis, and pushing off the back leg, so contraction in the glutes. And as we take this step, we have a pulling action, so contraction in the hamstrings, maybe some of the adductors as we rotate, pushing off the back foot, so the glutes, hamstrings. This side of the body starts to close, fold up, so contraction in the pec on the ipsilateral side of this forward arm, and then contraction in the external obliques, and relaxation in the internal obliques, and then contraction in the internal obliques and relaxation in the external obliques on the opposite side of the body as we start to rotate the other way. And then we finish contraction in the external obliques on the ipsilateral side of the punch, relaxation in the internal obliques, contraction in the serratus anterior, and probably the pec minor as the arm goes forward, relaxation in the lats, trapezius across the back. As the other arm pulls back, probably contraction in the rear lat here, contraction in the internal obliques, pulling this side of the body around, and relaxation in the external obliques. And then this leg pulling the other one forward, so contraction in the glute and hamstring. There's another variation of Bung Chuan. See, it's starting out hips and shoulders pretty much in line, center of balance in between the feet. Front leg pulls back, hips and shoulders still in line, weight in between the feet. Front foot steps out and turns out, rotates out. Rear foot rotates in, shoulders rotated with respect to the hips as the torso rotates outward. Hips turn forward, shoulders lagging behind a little bit. Rear leg comes up. And then punch executes. Hips and shoulders back in line. Both feet have rotated. Okay, now we'll look at the muscular tension. Here's the drawback. Legs come together, so pulling with the adductors to adduct both legs. Arms pulled in, so maybe some activation in the pecs, serratus anterior. Back is rounded, so trapezius is stretched. Maybe some activation in the external rotators of each hip. So front foot steps out and rotates out, so external rotation of the hip. Adductors stretched. Hip goes into extension, so we have some stretch here. Glute activation, hamstring activation. Legs lifted up, so as it pulls forward, you'll get activation in the hip flexor. And on the side where the arm is not extended, the contralateral side, External obliques activated, internal obliques relaxed, ipsilateral side, external obliques relaxed, internal obliques activated. We start to execute the punch. We see here now the ipsilateral side is the external obliques are now activated, internal obliques relaxed, lat is relaxed, trapezius relaxes as the arm starts to extend forward. Pec minor, maybe the pec major involve to pull the arm forward, serratus anterior, activation. Leg comes forward, so activation in the hip flexor, maybe some of the rectus femoris, and in the opposite leg, activation in the glute and hamstring as it pulls the body forward. All right, so we continue through. Activation in the glute and hamstring as this leg pulled the body forward. Activation in the rectus femoris as the leg extended forward. Activation in the external obliques, relaxation internal obliques, serratus anterior activated, trapezius and lats on the non-punching hand activated, and then we have the trapezius and lat of the punching hand relaxed, and the external obliques of the opposite side relaxed. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and hit the subscribe button so you can see my next video. And don't forget, I'm not an expert, I just play one on social media.